Hey guys, it's Lohpally here with another video, and today we're going to be going over the top 5 supports of patch 10.15. Most notably in this patch, the thing that changed the most was actually a huge buff to the Spell Thieves, which makes the mana regen in the early stage a little bit higher from 25 to 50%, and the scaling as it goes on and powers up, more AP and more regen tacked onto its leveled up versions of it too. Despite this, for the most part though, I think that this item will most likely be taken in the same situations as before and not in the ones that aren't. So what I mean by that is most of the Spell Thieves changes just mean that poking supports might be a little bit stronger, and you'll usually go the item continuously whether or not you have poke. If you can't proc it very well, then sometimes it can be really risky to opt into this because it might mean your quest takes a really long time if you can't play aggressive. Now, without further ado, let's jump into our top 5 supports of this patch. So, coming in at number 5 is going to be NAMI. NAMI has not received any changes in the recency, but I think in general her ability to heal that is really consistent in laning phase makes her quite strong, and the fact that she has also the option to score kills if she's ever hitting any bubbles. Now, the reason why she's kind of downwarded in this tier list is going to be mostly because of the fact that her skill expression becomes a lot harder as there's more high mobility champions like Volibear coming into the mark, so it's a little bit harder for you to hit your bubbles, plus some of her pairings aren't nearly as strong as some of the other supports that can pair with her really well. On top of that, I felt like NAMI didn't use the Spell Thieves that greatly, so the change to it doesn't really buff her that much at all, since most of the time you just want to play back and scale and play defensively and play for one item. It's kind of hard for you to play aggressively if you don't want to be playing really aggro in your laning phase. So jumping into the rune setup is going to be 2 variants. Number 1 is we can play the standard build, which I just like for myself, which is Airy, Mana Flow Ban, Transcendence, and Gathering Storm with Presence of Mind and Legends Tenacity. This build is mostly just has really good scaling. If you ever have lengthy games, Gathering Storm really starts to kick in at about 20 minutes, since your power curve after 200 AP allows your healing to deal bonus damage and bonus healing whenever it's bouncing once we break the 200 AP mark. Because of this, I really like this rune and it's very versatile. Another interaction I also am a big fan of is, since you have the Summon Airy, your E buff will proc Summon Airy, which will then proc Ardent. So it gives you a lot more flexibility when it comes to rolling out the Ardent buff, and generally just has really good scaling. Now, if you're struggling with laning phase, or maybe you're against an all-in lane, then you can opt into the other rune pages that I'm talking about, which is Guardian. Usually you take Font of Life, Bone Plating, and Revitalize. We just want as many tanky stats as we possibly can to just keep ourselves sustained through the lane. And then after that, I want to still take Presence of Mind and Legends Tenacity, just so that we have no mana conservative problems as the game goes on. On top of this, it'll give you 500 extra bonus mana, and it makes your champion quite powerful when you don't have to deal with as many mana constraints, since your W does cost a lot of mana. Regardless of what rune build you're going to be doing, for the most part, you're going to be doing the same item builds. I usually recommend Relic, but you can go Spell Thieves if you're against maybe another enchanter and you think you're going to trade a lot, and you can actually get your Spell Thieves quest completed in a reasonable time frame. After that, we're going to be getting Lucidity Boots and Athenes. Lucidity Boots plus Athenes gives us already 20% of our scaling CDR, so we want to get to that 40% as fast as possible. After that, we're going to be building Ardent Sensor or Shirelias. Just depends on what you feel like matters in the circumstances. If you feel like kiting or engaging is really important and maybe Ardent doesn't buff enough people, that's totally fine. But doing an Ardent build path as a secondary is completely reasonable too. After that, I'm a big fan of getting Death Cap, as your AP scaling on this champion is actually incredibly high. As we mentioned before, the W bounce increasing healing after you break 200. Plus, all of your spells actually have really good AP ratios, and also having AP amplifies the amount of movement speed your passive gives. Also, another thing to note too is when you are taking the Guardian build, I recommend taking the 1 to 10% CDR scaling rune, as you're not taking Transcendence. That way you can have an ironed out 40% CDR. So coming in at number 4 is going to be Senna. I feel like Senna is really good just because of her versatility. She fits into most team compositions, and she's actually a pretty hard carry champion if you're quite comfortable with dealing with auto attacks and dealing damage. I also like Senna because of the fact that I feel like range supports are kind of on the rise, and Senna's biggest problem was that she was squishy in the early stages and wanted to play aggro. Because most of the strong champions are actually enchanters nowadays, she actually matches up incredibly well against them, especially because she has easy access to executioners if any healing is going on. So jumping into rune setup is as follows. we're going to be doing the Glacial Augment. This allows you to get multiple auto attacks off, and your Q reminder also procs Glacial Augment as it procs on hit effects. This in combination with the approach velocity allows you to stack your souls incredibly fast, and that's pretty much what powers up Senna in the mid to late game. So we're going to be taking Glacial Augment, and then I switch between boots and the stopwatch depending on my matchup. If I feel like I don't need tier 2 boots, so maybe I'm against like a Soraka and I want to get Executioners, or a Lulu and I want to get Serrated Dirk early, then I opt into the boots. But if maybe I'm against something that can all-in me early, or I want to dodge skill shots like Thresh, Blitzcrank, or Nautilus, then I opt into the stopwatch talent instead. After that, we go Biscuits, so we have good sustain in lane, and approach velocity. Then for our secondary runes, we're going to be taking Presence of Mind once again, but Legend Alacrity most of the time. I found that the extra attack speed actually makes a pretty reasonable, meaningful difference, and it makes me a bit stronger as the game goes on. More damage is more power on this champion. So for the build path, we have kind of a couple of options. For the most part, we're going to be getting Swiftness boots. I like it just for the mobility and being able to dodge in and out of skill shots. The more movement speed you have, just the easier it is to navigate the map. Lucidity aren't a terrible secondary, but for the most part, I find myself almost always defaulting to Swiftness. After that, we're just going to be going Armor Pen items. So if you're playing against something like before where we mentioned like a Nautilus or a Blitzcrank, a Thresh, etc., it's not terrible to go Edge of Night as actually a first item to get that Banshees-like effect, so that it's a lot harder for you to get all in. Plus it means that you can play aggressively with the Banshee's Veil itself. If you're not going that though, then you're going to just get Umbral first and then Edge of Night second. After that, Youmuu's if you feel like you need to kite in and out, and then Dusk Blade if you just want as much damage purely from how much gold you put in to your champion. So if you don't need the Youmuu's on use effect, then this is a good substitute. Another thing to note too is if you are playing against a lot of healing, you'll get Executioners and you'll want to build your Last Whisper item. Because of this, you'll either cut Youmuu's or Dusk Blade, just depending on what situations you have. Now, if your team has a lot of physical damage, or maybe you're hitting a lot of tanks, a decent substitute for a first item is Black Cleaver. An interesting interaction with this champion is actually your auto attack and your passive with your mist seem to proc 2 stacks of it. So autoing and queuing will actually give 4 stacks immediately to a target. So if they're very tanky or you just have a lot of AD, it's not a terrible substitute for your first item. So coming in at number 3 is going to be Bard. Bard is really strong nowadays because you can put multiple points in the W to just sustain through the laning phase, and the fact that he can move around the map so easily and seamlessly means that he is the roaming god right now. On top of that, since he can get the chimes, which allow him to get EXP, and the fact that the EXP changes to the bottom lane, it means that when he's not soaking EXP, it actually gives a lot more extra EXP to him and his teammate. On top of this, he can also set up ganks extremely well with his portal and his ultimate, making him kind of like a one-and-all champion, but his champion is restrictive because of the fact that most of his spells are skill shots. So he has some difficulty curves, so he comes in at number 3. When it comes to rune setups, there's tons and tons of rune setups that you can run. I won't list them all, so we'll just go into 2 of them that are reasonably common. Number 1 is just kind of like the Enchanter-esque defensive Bard build, which is just Guardian, Demolish, Bone Plating, and Revitalize. The bottom tree can be changed out just depending on how much crowd control or how tanky you want to be. It's reasonable to also take Unflinching or Overgrowth depending on your playstyle. Then after that, for the most part, you're going to be taking for the secondary runes the Sorcery Tree with Celerity and Water Walking. This is really good for roaming around the map and getting the extra movement speed, especially in the early stages since boots are kind of expensive now. Another setup that you can take is Omni Stone. Omni Stone is kind of like a one-size-fits-all for the champion that people like to use just because all runes are relatively useful on him. You take the Omni Stone and then Stopwatch. After that, we take Futures Market a lot of the times because of the fact that we just want to get to our Moby boots as fast as possible to roam around, and then Approach Velocity. After that, the secondary is mostly up to you, but most of the people nowadays will take Bone Plating and either Overgrowth or Revitalize, just to be as tanky as possible since Bard's kind of short range. There are lots of rune pages that you can take, and plenty of them work for different styles. It's totally up to you for a lot of this on your playstyle and what you feel comfortable with. So when it comes to itemization, itemization is also kind of all over the place. A couple of setups that people like to run is getting the Moby Boots and then going Dead Man's Plate and Rapid Fire Cannon. I find this most effective if you just want to be like a pseudo carry, or maybe they have a lot of assassin-like champions and you want to be able to shock absorb engages or be able to create pressure. If you roam around a lot and you get a lot of early kills, this build feels pretty good, but it's quite bad from behind, so make sure that you're playing with a lead if you do a build like this. After that, most people end up getting things like Wit's End, and after that, the world is your oyster when it comes to your final item. Another build that is pretty common that I see, usually paired with the Guardian build, is kind of an Enchanter-like-esque setup. Shurilia's is actually starting to become really popular, and I really like it myself. It's kind of like a first item buy if I don't have Ardent or Athenes as an option. After that, we can get ourselves Redemption or Athenes. Both are actually acceptable, and usually you build them in tandem with each other, and this kind of allows you to leverage the bonus healing from Revitalize also. So if you plan on building this way, Revitalize is definitely the rune you want to end up taking. For the fourth item, Mikhail's is not terrible if you need some extra healing, or if you just need to be a little bit tankier. Deadman's Plate isn't actually a bad last item either. For the most part, Bard's kind of like a Build-A-Bear. You kind of can build your runes and your items just based on kind of the circumstances of your game and how you feel like your flow is going. Are you ahead? Are you behind? Can you fight in front line? Should you just be enchanting and kiting backwards, etc.? So jumping into number 2 is going to be Soraka. Soraka comes in at number 2 because of the fact that she is incredibly flexible and relatively easy to pick up. Since she doesn't need any specific team compositions and her healing numbers are quite powerful even with healing reduction, the champion functions really, really well. On top of that, because of the fact that her ultimate is global, she feels really, really powerful in the mid game because of the fact that if you ever have a frontliner who's really far ahead, he can go off and split push and have your ultimate to leverage team fights. Because of this, Soraka comes in at number 2. The 2 rune pages are kind of interchangeable just depending on your circumstances. Number 1 is running the Airy setup, which is more aggressive a little bit and it gives you a bit more AP, and then the Guardian setup, which is kind of the reverse of it. Jumping into the Airy setup, we'll be taking Summon Airy, Mana Flow, Transcendence, and Gathering Storm. After that, we'll be taking the Resolve Tree secondary with usually Bone Plating and Revitalize, but you can take Second Wind if you're against something that pokes you rather than all-ends you. Now, the reverse of it is just the Guardian page. Now, if you're against something that all-ends you quite frequently, or maybe you just have undodgeable poke and you just want to have the Guardian mitigate some of that, then we're going to take the Guardian, Font of Life, Bone Plating, or Second Wind, and Revitalize. But then we'll just opt into the secondary, which is Sorcery with Mana Flow and Transcendence. This means that at level 10, we'll be getting our 40% CDR cap really, really fast, and it powers up Soraka a lot. So when it comes to itemization, we're usually going to be taking Relic on this champion, but Spell Thieves is still reasonably fine to build if you feel like you're against something that's going to trade you quite a lot. Maybe you're against a NAMI or a Lulu. Then maybe if you can get Spell Thieves procs off consistently, it's not a bad option. After that, we're going to get Lucidity Boots and Athenes. This will instantly get you at 30% CDR with the Transcendence, so all we need is one more item, which is going to be Redemption. I normally don't like Redemption on most supports, but with Soraka's theme of actually being global and being able to heal herself with Redemption comes in as pretty much the best item for her after getting Athenes. Now, you can opt into overcapping CDR since we ran Transcendence. I found that I actually really like Shurilia's, even though it overcaps us on CDR, just because it gives you bonus healing and a lot of regen and a lot more tools to maneuver. And then my final item is usually actually Warmog. Since you built multiple items with HP attached to it, you should, as a last item, be able to hit the 3k HP spike to then have the HP regeneration. For those who don't know, if you're healing somebody, it doesn't actually technically count as in combat as long as you're not taking damage from an enemy player. So you can actually just heal yourself while the Warmog's passive is going off, and it'll continuously heal you while you're dumping heals into your teammates. It's really great for elongated fights. Big fan of it. Alright, and coming in at number 1 is going to be Lulu. Since the rise of champions like Ashe and Varus, Lulu pairs really well with a lot of these on-hit effect champions. The biggest problem with them is the fact that they're all in quite easily. And Lulu is equipped with a lot of easy-to-use peeling mechanics that makes her a really, really big menace as she gets into the mid-game. On top of this, she has very little item dependency, and she doesn't take a lot of skill to play either. So because of this, she comes in at number 1. So jumping into the rune pages is going to be kind of similar to how we looked at Soraka and NAMI. I have an Aerie page and a Guardian page that I kind of switch between depending on my circumstances. So for the Aerie page, we're just going to be taking Aerie, Mana Flow, Transcendence, Gathering Storm. Then after that, we're going to be taking the Resolve Tree secondary with Bone Plating and Overgrowth. I know a lot of people will be asking, but why not Revitalize? If you did not know this about Lulu, her ultimate is actually in a different category considered bonus health. This means that runes like Revitalize that give bonus healing and shielding don't actually count towards it. So because of that, I find that I like Overgrowth a lot more. Lulu's a relatively short range champion, and it feels really bad to use your shield or any peel to keep yourself alive. Because of this, I like Overgrowth to just have a little bit of a bump of HP so I can play a little bit more aggressively and create more space for my teammates without having to use cooldowns on myself. The other setup is going to be kind of the reverse once again, where we take Guardian, Font of Life, Bone Plating, and once again, Overgrowth. Then we take the Transcendence and Mana Flow from the Sorcery Tree. I like Transcendence a lot on most of the enchanters just because I feel like 40% CDR is one of the most important core mechanics of it, because more spells just equals more power on your champion. So because of that, I always value runes like Transcendence because 10% CDR is immeasurable. For itemization, we're going to be going a little bit of a weird build that'll confuse a couple people. For one, we'll be getting Lucidity Boots, but after that, with usually recommending Relics since Lulu is kind of hard to poke and prod on most cases. You can still go Spell Thieves if you want to be a little bit greedier, but for me, I like Relic a lot because of the same problems I brought up with the Overgrowth, where having the bonus health makes me feel like I can play more aggressively and I have to use less cooldowns on myself. This is a personal preference and not really what you need to do in most situations. But for our itemization, we're actually going to go Shurelya's first. The reason why I like Shurelya's nowadays is because you don't have to use your W defensively on your teammate to give them movement speed to catch up on fights. Plus, I really like the extra HP to make Lulu durable once again because she's short range. I found that this build feels way better than going Ardent first, as you are incredibly squishy. Plus, Ardent is actually a relatively weak item in the early stages since it scales with levels. After we do get the Shurelya's though, I do like to get Ardent as my second item. After that, it's mostly a flexibility of a lot of things. If you want, you can just go Death Cap because we've already got our 40% CDR. Or you can build things that make you a bit tankier. Maybe you want a Locket or a Zeke's just so that you don't die in team fights. But in most cases, I don't find myself in these kinds of situations. So I'll usually go Death Cap. Another question is maybe why don't you go Athene's? Well, the reason for that is you don't end up having any damage on this champion in a lot of the stages of the game. Q is your last maxed skill, so Athene's actually relatively feels quite bad, but it's not a terrible last item as maybe you start getting levels in your Q and you'll be dealing damage. But it's definitely a terrible item to rush on this champion since you only have 1 point in Q and it'll be really hard for you to stack it up. Anyway guys, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment in the section below, and hit that bell and whistle. I'll see you next time. Peace.